One day, monsters attack a village and kill the parents of a poor boy named Chuck, and he is determined to become an adventurer. But in this world, skill is the most important thing. The Supreme Creators gave us powers so that we could take revenge on the monsters. Disclose abilities to people before they turn 12, but they vary from person to person. Among all hunters, the S-Rang stands at the top, each of them wielding the power of an entire army thanks to their skills. As a child, the poor boy Chuck could also perform heroic feats like those we hear about in fairy tales. He begged the higher powers to give him a powerful skill, but the creators betrayed him when he received an unknown skill. The priest told him he couldn't be a hunter with that skill. But nevertheless, Chuck still became a porter for the adventurers, but the other adventurers constantly berated him for being just baggage. The skill he gained is called rebirth, and he will be able to resurrect himself once after he dies. But for adventurers, he had their most important weapon. But this skill was useless in battle, so he lived as a third-grade adventurer and did casual work for adventurers. But he was still proud of himself because he was doing his part, which is the defense of this country. The other adventurers Chuck went into the dungeon with, however, mocked him, saying that his sister was a very good adventurer, and she denied playing with him together. Adventurers use their skills such as flame armor and super strength to kill monsters. The adventurer ordered him to take the magic stones from the monsters' bodies, and he warned them that they were getting off the road if the map was to be believed, but the adventurers ignored his opinion and scolded him. But suddenly, they saw that there were many monsters hiding inside the dark cave. One of the adventurers started yelling that they were cannibals and they wouldn't be able to fight them because there were so many of them. The adventurer with firepower also thought that they wouldn't be able to defeat so many monsters, and he was making a plan to escape from this terrifying place. Meanwhile, Chuck was also fighting these monsters, and he realized that he too could not fight them with his current strength. But suddenly the guy with fire pushed him into the monster's lair, and he said that he has the rebirth skill, so he asks him to use that skill to save their lives by throwing him down. But Chuck was well aware that even if he came back to life, he couldn't. To escape the depths of hell on his own, and that he'll probably die again. The monster attacked him and ate him completely, leaving only a skeleton. The notification reported that the awakening skill was activated. Chuck started to regain consciousness, opened his eyes and thought that the awakening skill had worked and he was alive again. But he suddenly realized that he was just a skeleton, not a human being. He realized that he couldn't speak either. He decided to check his status window and found that he was back to level 1, although he was at level 9. Also, his rank had changed to Lich. The notification said that a Lich is a resurrected monster with an evil aura inside its bones, and it's a tough fight for mid-rank adventurers. But it is weak and has no intelligence. His skeleton got angry and started telling him not to mess with him since he had his own head that could think and stuff. He remembered the priest's words when he said that no one had a record of this skill appearing in the past, and they had no information about it. Chuck lay on the ground and began to think that returning to the human world with this body was practically a death sentence, and he remembered his sister telling him to stop being an adventurer if he didn't have the talent, and he was in complete agreement with her that only people with strong skills could become high-ranking adventurers. But he suddenly realized that monsters could evolve if they gained levels and also gained more skills. He realized that if he kept evolving and gaining skills, he could someday look like a human again. He thought that, if this really happened, he could become an adventurer. The S-Rang he had always dreamed of becoming, he also realized that it was a really weak monster, so he would have to rely on his human knowledge. He'll be able to slip past monsters with ease thanks to the fact that he'll pretend to be a skeleton, and with that, he'll get all the information about the area, and what monsters are weak. Chuck targeted a level 4 goblin and attacked the monster from behind using decoys and successfully killing it. He gained 3 experience points and advanced to level 3. He had successfully killed a monster of a higher level than himself, and at this rate, he would be able to reach the maximum level of a lich and then evolve his race. He also thought about the fact that he had already died once, so he would start raising his new levels as if his life depended on it. He fought against a slug goblin, but didn't get much experience from it, and he realized that he wouldn't be able to level up by killing weak monsters. So he went to hunt stronger monsters to increase his level. After becoming a monster, he didn't need to eat or sleep, and due to the lack of sunlight inside the dungeon, he lost all sense of time. He couldn't even tell if a whole day or weeks had passed since he became a monster. Chuck wondered if his sister had already noticed his disappearance, but he figured that even if she had noticed his disappearance, she probably wasn't worried at all. Now he was beginning to berate himself for thinking such bad things. After all, he was planning to hunt stronger monsters. Meanwhile, he pretended to be a dead skeleton in front of the red-eyed wolf. He reflected that if he defeated this monster, he would immediately increase his level. But the problem is that the level difference between them is too big, and the wolf is much stronger and faster than him. He pinned all his hopes on his intelligence and past combat experience, and he decided to follow the monster in its footsteps. Now he pretended to be a dead hunter with a luggage bag near the crevice to lure the red-eyed wolf. When the wolf approached, he attacked it with his sword and rushed after the wolf into the crevice. But the monster still wasn't dead and grabbed his arm. But he sacrificed his hand and still killed the monster. He gains 11 experience points and raises his level from 3 to 5, and the notice says he has met the conditions for evolution. He was really very happy about it. He thought that monster's body was much stronger and more comfortable than a human body. He instinctively knew how to evolve, so he approached the lake and began his evolution. He dreamed of making himself more like a human being. He looked at his reflection in the lake and realized that he had become a ghoul. A ghoul is a dead body transformed into a monster, also called a hand demon, with sharp claws and fangs. But its biggest advantage is its ability to regenerate. He was very happy because the ghoul certainly looked more like a human than a skeleton, and his arm that he had lost had grown back too. He also thought that maybe it was an evolutionary advantage to have a perfect body again. He decided to check his status window, and he had a new skill called regeneration. He was very happy to see that his stats had increased significantly, and he had also gained a skill. He knew that the level limit of a ghoul was at level 20, so he would be able to evolve again when he reached that level. Later, he fought a monstrous rat that was a D-rank monster, but the new claws got in the way and made it difficult to use the ball, so he threw away his sword in anger and attacked the monster with his claws, successfully killing it. Thus, he raised his level to level 6 after killing the rat. But this is still a long way from his 20th level of evolution. He used regeneration on his wound, and it instantly healed. But this new body was getting very hungry, and he had to eat rat meat to satiate his body. He was furious because he couldn't even stand the smell of dirty rat meat, and he was slowly turning into a monster. But he consoled himself that the food was more like human food, so it could be endured. A few days later, he fought against a level 14 orc and killed him and raised his level from level 13 to level 14. He wonders if he is raising levels at a very good rate and can easily risk his life thanks to his regeneration skill. He thinks that he is more powerful now than he was when he was human, and again he wonders what his sister is doing now. Once upon a time, Chuck had gotten along very well with Olivia, but for the past few years, she hardly spoke to him. Because of his skill set, he couldn't properly work as an adventurer and made very little money, but he still somehow saved money to support his sister. But unlike him, it turned out that Olivia had a magical skill that suited an adventurer, and she became a rank 7 hunter rather quickly, while her brother was still stuck at the D rank level. Olivia taunted him, telling him to stop being adventurous if he had no talent for it. She was the talented younger sister, so she started looking down on her worthless brother, and gradually they stopped talking to each other. Chuck thought that if he went back to the city in this guise, he would surely be destroyed. Besides, he still couldn't speak. He could only make some sounds. Suddenly he heard someone's human voice. Suddenly he discovered 3 people. They were adventurers. Most surprisingly, his sister was also among those hunters. He was very shocked to see his sister, but he realized that he would be killed if they found him, so he had to leave so they wouldn't see him. Meanwhile, Olivia was reprimanding the other searchers for not restocking the necessary supplies and medicines for the hunt, and they were making excuses for not noticing how quickly it was over. She was extremely unhappy and resented that she couldn't trust them because they were so irresponsible. Chuck heard the whole conversation while hiding behind a rock, and he pondered that she couldn't be so abrupt for nothing and decided she was right. He accidentally made a noise. One of the searchers happens to notice the noise and alerts her teammates, and Olivia uses her ice arrow and attacks in the direction where Chuck is hiding. An arrow slams into Chuck's arm and wounds him. He's trying to get out of there. The Seekers looked at Chuck and realized it was just a ghoul and they could easily take care of him. Chuck realizes that he is in a very bad situation. One of the Seekers was named Becca, and she was level 15. She explained that Vardalaks have a healing skill, and the other Seeker, whose name was Derek, was level 14, and he commented that he just needed to crush the monster with one blow to kill it. Olivia, who had level 18, explained that she would corner him with her attacks, and then they could kill him in one fell swoop. Chuck, meanwhile, was mulling over the fact that he wasn't even sure if he could beat them if it was one-on-one, and he was mulling over how to escape from this place. Derek used his skill, fire, to attack Chuck, and Becca, who had the skill, levitation, quickly coordinated with Derek to attack Chuck together. Chuck doesn't want to attack people, but he has no other choice, so he has to attack Derek, and he uses this opportunity to get away from there sooner. But Olivia attacks Chuck with an ice arrow at his feet. Chuck's legs were injured and he couldn't escape because of it. So he used his regeneration skill, but it took almost 1 minute to heal his legs, and he realized that it was too much time in this situation. Olivia approached him and was ready to kill Chuck with one shot. He dreaded to think that he would die at the hands of his own little sister. He realized that he wouldn't be able to dodge this attack because of his injured legs, and he wouldn't be able to jump on her to scare her either. So he suddenly remembers that with this new body he can at least make some sounds. So he tries to say his sister's name, Olivia, and Olivia suddenly remembers her brother, and she's intent on missing out. Derek starts yelling at her in utter shock, and doesn't understand how she could have missed the target at point-blank range. It was so easy. Chuck, meanwhile, pondered the fact that he could not survive if he was hit by an ice spear. He realized that this time he was lucky. Olivia was still in shock, wondering why this monster was screaming her name. Meanwhile, Chuck's healing was complete. He jumped next to Olivia, startling her, and she dropped her wand. Chuck immediately ran off and hid. Olivia was stunned to see that she had been tricked by the monster. She was disappointed that she had given in to her emotions and didn't realize what had happened. Derek started berating Olivia again for letting the ghoul go. He wondered how she could let that happen. Olivia, meanwhile, pondered that ghouls were human corpses that became after death and were turned into dungeon monsters, and she began to worry about her brother. Chuck, who had escaped and hid behind the wall, was very happy that he was able to escape even after being cornered by high-level adventurers. He was very happy that he had obtained a useful skill like regeneration, which was very useful in battles, unlike the revival skill. He also reflected on the fact that he needed to watch out for adventurers when searching for monsters. Chuck remembered his past when he first took his sister along to show him the dungeon, and she immediately outclassed him. She'd always been very smart. He watched them go to another part of the dungeon and wished he could go to the opposite direction, but suddenly saw Olivia and her team walking deep into this dungeon. Normal people can't stay in the dungeon for very long. Not only do they go astray, both physically and mentally, but there is another reason why the thick amana in the dungeon is poisonous to people. The longer people stay in the dungeon, the faster it kills them. When people get into a dungeon, they need a strategy to make sure they don't make mistakes. It must be dangerous for Olivia and her team to go even deeper at this level. But Chuck pondered the fact that he would indeed be killed if he was found again. He'd have to be careful. But he still planned to watch them from a distance. Meanwhile, the team discovered a dead body that was found by Olivia, and her team, they checked the corpse, but everything of value had already been stripped from it. Olivia orders them to move on, but Derek and Becca began to argue with her that they had already gone far enough and that it would be too dangerous to go any farther. Olivia claimed that she had traveled this far into the dungeon countless times, and with their skills and level, there should be no problem if they're just going to get their act together. Chuck, who was following them and secretly listening to their conversation, thought that the really strong monsters dwelled more in the deeper dungeon because the mana more dense is deeper. He wondered why his sister, who was always rational, was in such a hurry. Then suddenly a huge monster appears in front of them, and it's a level 22 OGR. Chuck realized that it was an unusual monster because monsters above level 20 must be even deeper. Chuck was very worried about his sister, and he thought about jumping on the monster to distract it so his sister could safely escape, but then he realized that Olivia might think it was just another monster, and they would panic even more. So he decided to just observe the situation. Derek started yelling at Olivia in a frenzy that he had warned them to come back and now it wasn't clear what they were going to do. But Olivia began to calm him down and said that with her magic, she could damage even the ogre so they would be invincible if they acted together. Derek doubted whether he could kill this monster or not, but he knew that even if he tried to run away, the monster would surely catch up to him and kill him. So he had no choice but to fight. Derek activated the skill, flame coating, but the monster suddenly attacks him. Becca uses her levitation skill to increase her speed to attack the monster, but the monster doesn't react to her speed at all and just a light blow sends her flying. At the same time, Olivia prepared her magic and attacked the monster with ice arrows. But this attack didn't hurt the monster much, and she thought she would have to use a more powerful attack to kill Ogre. Chuck, who was watching everything that was going on, realized that they didn't have enough levels and also had rather poor coordination. Therefore, he wondered why his sister had gone so deep into the dungeon with a random group. Olivia thought about using the ice spear to defeat this enemy, but she needed more time to prepare herself for this magic, and for that, Becca would have to be distracted for an even longer period of time. Derek realized that they were so low level that they lacked speed, strength, and magic, and at this rate they would really die soon enough. Olivia ordered them to attack and distract the monster, and if they delayed this fight, they would have no chance of winning. Derek was getting angry and thinking that the whole thing was delusional, that Olivia really wanted them to attack this horrible monster, while she would be safely behind them. But suddenly an idea pops into his head and he calls Becca and tells her something. Chuck, who was watching what was going on, realized that they were planning something. Derek and Becca started fighting the monster to keep its attention on them. Meanwhile, Olivia prepared her strongest attack, the ice spear. Derek suddenly signals to Becca and they both run out of range from the monster's attack. They run away and leave Olivia completely defenseless while she is in the middle of a magic spell. Chuck was furious to see that Derek and Becca had left his sister alone at a very critical time. But luckily Olivia had her ice spear ready. Attacking the monster, she chopped off one of its arms. But the monster hits her with his club, causing her to fly off to the side. Without thinking, Chuck runs to his sister and hears Derek talking. He says that it's all Olivia's fault, and that she's willing to go so far underground just to find her brother, who disappeared into the dungeon. I mean, everyone knows that if adventurers disappear, they surely die soon. Chuck was very shocked to hear that Olivia had taken such a risk just to find him. Lying on the ground, Olivia was on the verge of fainting, muttering to herself, wondering why he had to be so reckless when he was so weak, and wondering where he could have gone after all. She was delirious and passed out afterward. The monster, meanwhile, is about to kill Olivia, who is lying unconscious. But Chuck arrives in time and protects her. Chuck, who was only a level 14 ghoul, now had to fight a level 22 in rank. See, huge monster. He realized that he was a level far behind the monster, but the monster only had one arm, so he still had a chance to defeat it. After all, his sister's life depended on it. Chuck tried to attack the monster in the place where it didn't have an arm, but still it wasn't that easy, and although the monster was one-armed, but its attack speed was monstrous. Chuck could easily dodge all of the monster's attacks because they were very predictable due to the fact that he only had one arm. He came up with a strategy to make the monster tired. He knew that once the monster got angry, he would start using his fangs, but he no longer had the strength to defend himself. Therefore, he purposefully sacrificed his one arm and attacked the monster's weak point, which bit off his arm with its fangs. Thus, Chuck successfully killed the monster by slicing its neck in half with his fangs. For this achievement, he gets 128 experience points, and he level up from level 14 to level 18. He was also very surprised that he had somehow still managed to defeat him, and now he was using his regeneration skill to regrow his arm again. Chuck shouldered his sister and carried her on his back while she was still unconscious, and he wondered what would happen if he told her about himself, for she might go back into the dungeon to look for him. He suddenly finds his own sword that he had discarded earlier. He decides to pretend to attack Olivia in front of the other Seekers so that they will come and rescue her. Meanwhile, he's running away. After a while, Olivia regains consciousness and asks where she is. The adventurers tell her that she was unconscious and was attacked by a ghoul. She is worried in a state of shock and wonders what happened to the ghost. She still remembers someone carrying her when she was unconscious. She felt very nostalgic about it because her brother had once carried it as well. Suddenly, the adventurer points to a sword and asks Olivia if it is her sword. When she looked at this sword, it had text written on it that said, "I will definitely be back, so just wait for me." She was very happy that her brother was still alive. At the same time, a very excited Chuck was running around the dungeon, thinking that he just needed to complete 2 more levels to increase his level, and after that, he would be able to look more human-like. Later, he starts chasing some strange creatures called ogres, and their level was around 14. After killing the monsters to gain experience, he decided to taste these creatures. Their tentacles were like rubber and their skin was as hard as metal. He pondered that he would level up so quickly because normal monsters would never challenge stronger monsters. And since humans couldn't stay in dungeons for long, they were free to hunt wherever they wanted. Chuck reflected that after his first transformation, he was much closer to being a human than a skeleton or a ghoul. He hoped that he would be able to go out on the town after his next evolution. Chuck couldn't stop worrying about it because there was nothing he could do about it. Now he reflected that even though he was only 2 levels away from evolution, that was pretty far away because he couldn't expect any level up until he was fighting monsters stronger than himself. But he had no plans to fight something like Ogre again. He planned to fight weaker monsters and take his time to level up. His musings were interrupted by a strange sound. Someone was sneaking up behind him with a sword and started attacking him. He barely had time to comprehend anything and wondered in horror what level of monster had attacked him. It was a level 21 gargoyle. Chuck was shocked to see another monster above level 20 in the outer part of the dungeon. The gargoyle spewed fire from its mouth and used the fire as cover to attack him. Chuck was hurt during the attack, but he somehow manages not to suffer any critical injuries. But he was still in a pretty bad place, and he realized that he was only able to defeat Ogre because his sister had already taken one of his arms away from him. He's completely insecure and realizes he doesn't stand a chance win this fight, so he tries to run away, but the gargoyle is very fast and catches up with him. So he turns around and attacks the gargoyle with a fist strike. But it doesn't even leave a scratch on the gargoyle's body. He can't run any further because now there is a cliff in front of him. The gargoyle ignites its fire again and attacks him, but he dodges and makes the monster fall down, and also jumps on her and attacks her in midair. And finally, the damage from the fall helps kill the monster. Chuck gets 108 experience points and is promoted from level 18 to level 20. He looked at the monster and rejoiced at his luck, because he never thought he could defeat it. He suddenly realizes he has reached the coveted level 20 and appears notification that he has reached the ultimate level and his evolutionary conditions have finally been met. He approaches the lake again and hopes to become more human-like after his evolution, and as he begins his evolution, his overall body structure changes, and it becomes clear that a new stage of evolution has been reached. He gets a little bigger and a mask appears on his face. He tries to take off his mask, but he fails. Now he realizes that evolution is bringing the monster closer to his perfect power, and he really wants him to look like a human, but this new evolution makes him a perfect monster everywhere he looks. His new guise is an undead monster that mimics the form of the living to attack them, and those who see his true form never return alive. Chuck realizes that this monster is much scarier than the ghoul. He checks his status window and sees that he now has a new skill called Masquerade, and he begins to think that perhaps he could be the one to transform into a human using this skill. He began to use the Masquerade skill and the mask on his face began to fall and he finally began to transform. When he looked at his reflection, he was completely shocked because he now looked the same as before. He had a hoarse voice, but still he could speak again. He was very happy, but at the same time he could feel the strength draining out of him. He checked his status windows and saw that his new disguise skill only allowed him to temporarily take on human form. His maximum strength was 26, so he could only maintain his human form for about 4 hours. Chuck realized that it would be hard for him to live in the city if he suddenly turned into a monster because of his lack of strength. But there was still hope, because he could raise his level and his next evolution was supposed to make him even more human-like. So he decides to raise his level even higher. But suddenly he feels a strong earthquake in the dungeon. He doesn't understand what is happening. He gets scared of the unknown. The earthquake subsides after a while, but Chuck wonders if this was a sign of disaster in the dungeon. For there is a legend that deep underground lie the corpses of giant monsters in a special space that was formed as a result of the dark mana that comes out of their bodies, and if the dungeon is left alone and allowed to accumulate mana for a long time, it will cause unnatural phenomena to erupt, and all the monsters will come out of the dungeon and start attacking everyone in their path. Chuck suddenly remembers that there was also a sign indicating the appearance of a C-rank monster in the outer part of the dungeon, but he realizes it would be rash to do so to make a decision in only those 2 cases. Suddenly, a gargoyle appeared from nowhere, and Chuck realized in his haste to think that it was the gargoyle that caused this dungeon earthquake. But there was no time to think because she immediately started attacking him. He decided to use a rock to attack because he no longer had claws. It was hard for him to gather his strength because of the fact that he was in human form. The gargoyle used fire, but Chuck, who already knew the trick, turned into a monster again and clawed at her neck. Chuck once again used his regeneration skill on his injured body parts to heal them. He thought that after evolving he could easily kill a gargoyle, so he would probably be able to fight and defeat all by himself. Chuck was glad that monsters had a fatal weakness and he didn't. Plus, he had dungeon mana resistance and didn't even feel tired because he was undead. His musings were interrupted by a pack of gargoyles that decided to attack him, and immediately his confidence turned to fear and he ran as fast as he could. He hides behind a large rock and doesn't understand what is happening, why there were so many of them. He begins to assume that the number of powerful monsters that have appeared in the dungeon is increasing, indicating some kind of change in its structuring. However, after a crazy battle with one gargoyle, he skins his opponent and gains the laurel of a worthy defender, thanks to which he has already reached level 21, possessing outstanding physical abilities, and incredible endurance and skillful use of his many skills. Chuck realizes that his opponent is many times stronger in his shell, indicating that the crisis of the dungeons are not far off. Chuck realized that in the future, the dungeon bosses would begin to unite, thus amplifying lightning-fast destruction. Once outside, they would begin to try on fast-paced destruction everywhere. The most effective way to stop this crisis now would be to destroy the heart of the dungeon, that is, the boss. Chuck, almost unraveling his manipulations, heard someone's footsteps. Lurking on the far side, he rushes his hearing to the sound. Meanwhile, a voice is heard. It says that the underground disaster is coming, and if we don't take up the cause, it will be too late. It was Frank, a level 20 adventurer. Next to him was Gil, a level 19 player. The latter was sure they needed to go back and report to the guild about their findings. However, Shelley, a level 18 player, interrupted him, claiming that they must defeat the boss before anyone gets hurt. They begin to speculate about the risks, but Frank believes that the dungeon disaster will only get worse over time, and they have a chance of meeting the boss before he gets too strong. Nevertheless, they reason that it is risky to challenge the dungeon lord without having enough information. Frank reminded them that future unemployment and famine would be the consequence if the dungeon became a nest of monsters, exemplified by the disaster that had changed Shiel's hometown into ruins. Meanwhile, Gil abruptly refocuses his attention and soon spots Chuck, immediately, without hesitation shooting him. Interestingly enough, he made no movement and was discovered anyway. Gil explains that, thanks to his Artemis eye, he realized there was something at the top. Chuck, in turn, realizes he has no other options and decides to use his masquerade skill to save himself. Soon he steps out in front of them, posing as an ordinary adventurer. He explains to the searchers that he was hiding because meeting someone inside the dungeon could lead to trouble, even if they are not bandits. Gil was distrustful of the sinister energy emanating from this new man, while Frank thought Chuck was just some clueless adventurer. Even after Chuck concealed his true identity, the adventurers continued to be wary of him. Frank apologized for the arrow aimed at him, but notices that he was unhurt despite being in the middle layer of the cave. His clothes looked like he had been here all day, and Frank asked if he had a weapon and what his level was. Chuck was very nervous and afraid that if they dug too deep, his mask would be revealed, and that couldn't be allowed to happen. Meanwhile, Shelley suddenly reports a disaster in the dungeon and asks if Chuck can make it alone. She's friendly enough with him and wonders if he came here alone and what about his companions. Shelley offers Chuck their help and offers to help him safely to get out of this dungeon. But Chuck senses that Gil is very hostile, unlike Shelley, and decides that until his identity is finally revealed, to run away from them, answering Shelley that he can handle himself. Frank stops Gil from attacking Chuck from behind, and Shelley worriedly asks if it will be okay if neither just leave him alone. Shelley is also angry that her team is so hostile to such a nice guy and calls Gil violent. And Frank called her naive and said he suspected that Chuck was most likely a criminal and that if it weren't for her kindness, there probably wouldn't have been any way to avoid a fight with him. Frank suggested just forget about this guy and get on with more important matters. He suggested that they try to attack the monster boss. He looked at his friends and wanted to hear their opinions on the matter. Gil agreed with him. He said they should go because it would be easier to take care of it now, and in the worst-case scenario, they could always escape. Shelley was very happy to know that Gil agreed to help them get rid of the boss monster. She also adds that they will succeed because they are the best players in the guild, and they are not easily defeated. Meanwhile, there was no way Chuck could recover his breath after running away. He was breathing heavily inside the dungeon and looking around, wondering if they were following him or not. He began to think of Shelley and thought it had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him so affectionately. He felt sad. It had been so long since he had turned into an undead. For over a week, eventually even his group members were cold to him as well. Then he began to remember the words of the adventurers, of what they had said to challenge the boss. However, he doubted if they would take on the task. This group seemed to be tempted, yet he felt uneasy about their choices, for they would have to become leaders in a dungeon disaster. He concluded that worrying about them was a waste of time because even if he wanted to help them, they would still be in a fight and his presence might hinder them based on their attitude towards him. It's quite possible that they underestimate his powers in human form. Meanwhile, Gil reasoned that it was too big a place for a monster and it must be the dungeon boss. He and his team were preparing to do battle with the most powerful monster they've ever faced. And then they see the king of all gargoyles himself, a huge monster that looks very much like a gargoyle. Shelley watches stunned as the monster reaches level 30, and she realizes that they need to give 100% or more to win. Frank launches a powerful attack on the monster using his sword, but all to no avail. However, he notices the monster's vulnerable spot and attacks it. But even after this attack, the monster doesn't take any damage. The monster then attacks Shelley, however she quickly realizes that the monster is moving very slowly and with her convincing sword princess technique. She launches an attack on the monster, but as it later turns out, it is futile and it is impossible to affect the monster in this way. Even Gil's arrows were useless against such a powerful monster armor. Suddenly the monster activates his magic skill, Fire Whirlwind, and attacks Frank. But then he sees the monster's vulnerability and uses his strongest attack. Using this moment, Gil tries to hit the monster's eye with an arrow, but in response, the monster attacks the two of them at the same time. As a result of the battle, Frank loses consciousness and he was on the verge of being destroyed. Shelley tried to protect the others and put her body on the line. At that moment, Chuck appears out of nowhere. He stops the monster's attack and says the words, "From now on, I will be your opponent," addressing the monster directly. Shelley, with shock on her face, looks at him suspiciously, asking if he's the same guy they used to date and why he came to the rescue. Some time ago, Chuck doubted his determination, but he was sure that he had to help, that even if he couldn't do much, he still had to do his best to protect people. After all, that was the reason he became an adventurer. Despite all the humiliation, he realizes that it is inappropriate for him to worry about his appearance and that he can be useful to adventurers. However, despite the monster's injuries, Chuck feels that he can't do it alone. Thoughts of advising the others to run away cross his mind, but when he sees their haggard faces, he realizes it's impossible. The monster took some light damage despite fighting the three adventurers. The monster used its fire whirlwind to confuse Chuck, but the latter found the monster's weak spot in its eye and attacked it. Despite this, the monster continued to attack Chuck until Gil gathered his strength and broke through the wall and hit him with a rock. This gave Chuck a chance for one last attack, and he defeated the monster. Not believing his eyes himself, Chuck realizes that he was able to defeat a monster much higher level than his own. He gained 630 experience points and raises his level from 21 to 25. The dungeon was created by evil mana that only the boss could collect. Now, after defeating him, steps had to be taken to turn the dungeon back to a normal place and return the monsters to their normal lives. Chuck was concerned about whether he had become undead during the battle. Meanwhile, Gil looked at him and started to say that without Chuck, they wouldn't have been able to defeat the monster regardless of where Chuck came from, although he was curious to know something about him because he and his group had never heard of him. Learning that he had greatly increased his level through this disaster, Chuck feels a surge of luck and joy. His joy is interrupted by Shelley to thank him for saving their lives. Meanwhile, Chuck has noticed that his power is almost depleted, and he will no longer be able to hide his face. Any moment the transformation will happen. He decides to run away from her, explaining that he does not have time to deal with trivialities. Gil was extremely surprised by his behavior, and it wasn't clear to him what was wrong with this guy who didn't even take the trophy, the stone from the boss, proof that the disaster was over. Shelley had picked up on the fact that he had saved them and left modestly without giving his name. She admired that. But Gil didn't think so. It was strange to him that he was wandering the dungeon all alone. He was alarmed by this behavior. He had been injured, but he had recovered miraculously. Was that his talent? He wondered. Frank, who was badly hurt, suddenly stood up and rebuked Gil for his distrust. Frank pointed out that this guy saved everyone even though everyone was suspicious of him. He has some strange circumstances, but he's a good guy and shouldn't be accused of anything. Meanwhile, Gil was struggling to extract the mana stone from the monster. Shelley asked Frank if they could have the rock, since they weren't the ones who defeated the monster and it wouldn't really be fair. But Frank replied that they needed the rock to show everyone that the disaster was over and then to pay Chuck for his help if they met again. Shelley agreed that they should definitely meet and thank him for saving her. Meanwhile, Chuck had reverted back to his original form as his mana had depleted. However, he was very happy to see that his level was now 25. This meant that his mana had also increased and would be enough to sustain the masquerade in the 4-6 hours. He thought that his mana should recover after a full day of rest, and if he could hide for 12 hours he would manage to survive. He contemplated developing his skills so that he could return to human society. In the Adventurer Guild, in the capital itself, everyone was shocked when they heard about the dungeon disaster and the victory over the monster boss. Frank was colorfully telling the people present that he was telling the truth, and even for him. This was the first time he faced a level 30 monster, and if this monster boss wasn't defeated, the entire area might turn into a nest of monsters. The guild master listened to this story and had strong doubts. He countered to Frank that it was very hard to believe, because it was literally impossible to subdue such a monster alone, and Frank confessed to him that it wasn't their victory. The guild master looked at him suspiciously and asked him who was the hero who could defeat the monster boss himself. The restless Shelley suddenly jumped in between them, shouting happily that this hero had defeated the boss in an instant. The guild master looked at her worriedly and clarified. Was she really talking about someone who had single-handedly defeated a level 30 monster boss? The guild master doubted her honesty and recognized it as another of Shelley's delusions. Shelley indignantly insisted that it was the plain truth that they had been saved by a young man with white hair, a manly face, and sharp eyes. Gil, meanwhile, remembers his appearance a little differently. Shelley's so-called gallant boyfriend, who has skinny cheeks, pale skin, and a grim aura and lifeless eyes. Gil says that she will exaggerate everything about him. Shelley indignantly accuses Gil of trying to make him look bad. Into this conversation, Frank intervened to clear the air. He explained that they did help him a little, but there was no doubt that most of the credit goes to this guy. The guildmaster still doubted their story. It was hard to believe. But Frank tried to convince him that no one in their right mind would diminish their own accomplishments. He said that he would see for himself someday that they had actually fought a level 30 boss, and shows him the trophy, a huge rock. The other adventurers were shocked to see such a huge, ominous magic stone, and someone remarked that it meant that the hero these adventurers were talking about really existed. But they still had a hard time believing it, because there was no way a hero of such a high level could be unknown. It was also strange to the adventurers that this hero just hid after defeating the monster boss and didn't even bring his trophy with him. Someone suggested that he was just a noble guy who doesn't advertise his victories and doesn't want extra glory, while another adventurer suggested that this hero is so obsessed with battles that he doesn't care about recognition. Shelley intervened in their conversation again. She started talking about how he was just a noble knight who didn't need extra fame and recognition, that he was the strongest she had ever met. It was obvious she was fascinated by her savior. Olivia, who was in the guild at the same time and heard the whole conversation, thought that fighting alone against a level 30 boss was incredible, and you had to be a real adventurer. But she couldn't think of anything else than her brother. She was really worried about him because she knew he was in the same dungeon where this disaster happened, and she hoped that nothing happened to him. She was only glad that the boss that had been defeated would no longer be able to draw mana from the depths of the earth, and so there would be far fewer monsters in the dungeon, and it would have to be at least a few years before a new monster boss would appear. She thought about the fact that the dungeon was a little safer and she could resume her search for her brother again. Meanwhile, Frank was very happy with the reward he received and said it was worth risking their lives. Gil pondered that this victory money would pay off their debts, allow them to purchase new equipment, and perhaps still have some left over for luxury items. Frank split the winnings into 3 parts and distributed to his team, but for Shelley he made an exception and gave her most of the winnings. He explained that she was going to go to her hometown for the first time in a long time and she would need them more. He asked her to be careful because the law and order in this town is even worse than before. Shelley thanked him for his kindness and told him that someday this act would pay him back 10 times over. They said goodbye to Shelley, and Frank suddenly became serious and thoughtful. He began to reason that it seemed that the mana from the depths of the earth was getting stronger every year, and according to some great scientists, this whole kingdom would be swallowed up by the dungeon within a century, and maybe it was pointless for them to risk their lives and waste the money they would still make from the dungeon disasters. Meanwhile, Chuck, the hero and monster killer, keeps killing different monsters to gain more experience. He hunted monsters all day long, and he became so strong that he could no longer raise his level. He realized that he had reached the limit of this dungeon. The main boss had been killed, so there were almost no monsters, and soon it was worth waiting for the adventurers who could come to take the magic stones from the dead monsters. So there was no longer any reason to stay here. He pondered the fact that he needed to find another dungeon where he could level up. Chuck really wanted to get back to his sister, but it was a big risk to show up in that neighborhood. He pondered the fact that even if he took on human form, he wouldn't be able to completely hide his fangs or markings. He was able to fool Shelley and the others in the dark dungeon, but it would be dangerous to walk around the city. He suddenly remembers that he had heard in the past about a place called Field where, thanks to a disaster in the dungeon, no one cared about the corpses or monsters lying in the streets. Rumor had it that public order was so bad in this town that surely no one would object to a suspicious guy like Chuck. So Chuck decided to take on human form, find some clothes and put on a hood so he could hide his fangs and skin color, and he planned to get his winnings by taking the magic stones from the monsters he killed in the dungeon. He walked out of the cave for the first time since he turned into a monster. He wandered around the city. He was very happy to be among people again, but he didn't like the fact that people were paying attention to him. He wanted to quickly find some clothes that would hide his face better. He needed to find an inn where he could hide after the masquerade skill was canceled. A little later, he went to the city's Adventurers Guild to give away 3 magic stones of monsters above level 20 for sale. The bartender was surprised that such a weak-looking guy was able to get these magic stones without weapons. Chuck pondered that these gargoyle stones he had picked up when he left the dungeon would bring him enough money to stay in town for a while. The bartender had offered him only 500 gold coins for them. Chuck was shocked at such an offer and thought he might be playing a joke on him. He talked about how he could easily get 10 times as much in the capital, more than he offered him. The bartender said that this was not the capital, but a city of outcasts and scoundrels, and in any other place he would have been asked for proof that the stones were not stolen. But here he was not even asked about it. He also noticed that Chuck had come in wearing tattered clothes and had blood on them, but he'd let him down on that too. Chuck was saddened by the outcome of this situation. He realized that with this amount of money, he could not do anything. He would have enough for a couple of days. Suddenly, an unknown man appears on the road and says that this is the first time he has seen Chuck in this town, that he is unfamiliar with his face. Chuck looks at him warily, but the man claims that he shouldn't be afraid of him, and he introduces himself as Jeff. He also recommends that Chuck listen to him to stay out of trouble because there are certain rules in this town. Just when Chuck wanted to believe him, he suddenly pins him against the wall and asks him to give him all the cash he just got from the bartender, and in return he offered to protect him. But Chuck replies to him that he doesn't need any protection. Jeff, on the other hand, looks at Chuck with a sneer and says he can't do it to disobey him. He decides everything. But Chuck suddenly pushes him back and the man falls to the ground. All the passers-by start laughing at this man because he's just been knocked out by some pathetic-looking brat. Chuck analyzes him and declares that it looks like this guy is level 20. His self-confidence enrages Jeff and he draws his sword to fight in broad daylight. But the man's friends stop him and tell him not to do that and start a fight with him. Meanwhile, Chuck, seizing the moment, slaps him on the wrist and forces him to the sword falls out of his hands. He decides to run away. He could have easily defeated Jeff, but that would only make him stand out even more. And everyone would be talking about him, and he shouldn't be standing from the crowd right now. He had been frustrated for the last few hours. He had no sooner arrived in this town and he had already been scammed and extorted for money. It was not a pleasant experience. He was sitting on the bed in the hotel room he had rented. He had to buy a blade and a robe to hide in, and it was already a big waste of money for him. There wasn't much left. Meanwhile, Shelley had already arrived in her hometown and the priest she visited was surprised at the amount of coins she had placed before him. He expressed that he was pleased at her generosity and that she had become such a good earner, but he was worried about her and recommended that she go back to where she came from and continue to live her own life. Shelley answered him that she would always be grateful to the church that raised her after she was orphaned by the dungeon disaster. Meanwhile, one of the kids wondered if she really was a known adventurer and whether she could close the disaster whole. Shelley smiled at him and promised that she would definitely be able to do it someday. At the same time, Chuck was walking along the road, thinking that everyone around him was so unfriendly. No matter who he met on the road or who he tried to get some information from, they were always trying to trick him. He considered the option of just taking the magic stones and going to the capital to get the coins. But that was too risky. He could get caught. He turned into an alley and realized that this town was his only option for now. Meanwhile, Shelley had already come out of the church and was walking toward him. She recognized him immediately. She stopped him incredibly cheerfully and said, "It's you, the same hero who saved our lives." Chuck was completely overwhelmed by the encounter. He wondered what the odds were to meet the same unknown person twice in two different places. Shelley talked about how excited she was to see him, because she was so afraid she would never see him again. She continued to mumble emotionally that she was so happy to be able to tell her family and then to be surprised to see him again. She thought that maybe he wouldn't recognize her, so she decided to reintroduce herself, that she was Shelley, whom he had met in the dungeon, that she was quite the reliable middle adventurer of a level 18 rank. Chuck wondered why she, an experienced adventurer, was in this city, and those guys who were in the dungeon with her didn't look like criminals either. After all, that was the kind of people this city was known for. He also realized that he shouldn't be socializing with her, and at any minute Oan could check his status window. But Shelley couldn't stop mumbling happily that she wanted to thank him in any way she could. Chuck suddenly runs away from her, saying she picked the wrong guy. Shelley tries to stop him, but she suddenly remembers that Frank told her he might be a criminal, so she runs after him and tells him that she won't pry into his past. She just wants to thank him. Chuck was afraid that suddenly she knew that he was actually a monster, and that's the reason she kept chasing him. After a while, Shelley lost sight of him, and she realized that being so fast was most likely made him so fast by his highest level. Meanwhile, Chuck had run into some kind of dead end, but he was glad there was finally no one around. He thought about the fact that with his physical abilities and werewolf claws, he could easily climb that wall. Chuck turns his hand back into claws and starts climbing the wall, but unfortunately his sword falls and he jumps back to the ground to retrieve his sword. Due to the fact that he abruptly jumped down, from the excitement, he hurt his back. Then Shelley appears out of nowhere and looks at his strange condition. She asks him why he's lying on the ground, what happened to him, and apologizes for running after him. Chuck got to his feet and said that nothing was wrong, that he was fine, and he decided to ask her about what she'd said earlier, if she really wasn't going to dig into his past. She convinces him that she promises him not to talk about his past, and she's not going to dig into it, because he's her savior, and besides, everyone has their own circumstances. Chuck was actually glad that now he at least had someone to talk to, because he was incredibly lonely. Shelley asks him for his name, since she didn't even know how to address him. He, worried, still says his name is Chuck. He asks why she's in this town, but taking her sad face away, he says she doesn't have to answer that question if she doesn't want to. She talked about being in the capital city for the most part, but this is her hometown, so she comes here from time to time to see how everyone is doing. She also told him that once upon a time, many years ago, this town was a very beautiful place and it was very prosperous, and it was a good and kind town. She told me that there was a dungeon near the city known as the Catastrophe Dungeon, and suddenly it started to turn into the Catastrophe Dungeon. When she was still young, monsters started attacking the city, and everyone with status or money fled the city. Soon this city became a gathering place for criminals, creating the ruined city that everyone knows today as such. The criminals may protect this city from monsters, but they see the former inhabitants as nothing more than slaves. She also said that her dream is to become a first-class adventurer, prevent disaster, and free this city from all evil. Meanwhile, on the other side of the church, A boy was telling his father that he too wanted to join Shelley and become an adventurer when he grew up. The boy shows off his skills and says he is sure he can help the adventurers, and together they will make so much money and make sure the church never lacks anything. Suddenly, the father hears footsteps of people approaching the church and thinks that there are usually no people who come here. The boy goes to the door, thinking that maybe Shelley is back again. But two men in dark clothing stand on their doorstep, and the boy asks them who they are and what they want in such a place. The father points out the symbols on their clothes and says that these men belong to a group of evil dragons who rule this city. One of the strangers was Jeff, the same man who had tried to trick Chuck that morning. He explained that they were here because they were short on labor, so they needed some free slaves that they could freely use. They said that their boss told them to scour the whole town, even places like this. He also said that these kids are usually naughty and annoying, but he's sure they can be quiet if ordered to. The priest fell on his knees and begged these evil bandits to spare the little children. He begged that instead, they would take him away and make him their slave. Jeff looked at the priest indifferently and said he didn't need a weak old man like him laughing at him. And at this time, the boy suddenly uses his skill, Fireball, and attacks them. The second of the villains suddenly deflects his powerful attack with a single hand movement. He then tells the boy that he is still too inexperienced and offers to teach him how to use the skill properly. He then activates his lightning skill, which instantly destroys the wall. He also suggests the other one to kill the naughty child to make an example for the others. The priest, realizing that they could really kill the child at any moment, grabs a steel bar and attacks them. He too was adventurous in his youth, and his defense skills are still present to this day. He takes on these villains and tells the child to run away. The boy runs away, and Jeff yells in return that there are many more children here, and all of them will definitely not run away from them. They don't care who they make slaves of. Other children come out of their room when they hear a loud noise outside. Meanwhile, they grab the priest and warn the children if they try to escape, they will kill him. They also threaten him that they will gradually increase their lightning power until he agrees to their demand. Meanwhile, on the other side, Chuck asks for Shelley's help to show him the way, since all the streets seemed the same to him. She said she would be happy to help him, as she knows the town and all its neighborhoods very well. At the same time, Shelley gets the idea that she and the team sold the magic stone, and she starts apologizing to Chuck for it and promises that she will try to pay him back all the money that should have belonged to him. Chuck explains to her that he doesn't really care about money, but then he remembers that he has nothing to pay for a night at the inn and asks her to lend him 200 gold pieces for rent. Their conversation is interrupted by a little boy. Crying, he tells Shelley what has happened, that some scary people have come to the church and are going to kill his father. He asks for her help, because time is too short. Chuck was determined to help Shelley, not because she was the only source of information he had, but because it was a personal matter for him, because he too was an orphan and raised by the church. And he could not let her fight evil alone. Meanwhile, the priest was already on the verge of death and realized that he had only a little bit left. He was no longer able to endure this pain, but he endured to the last. Because he wanted to protect his children, he could not bear to see the villains take them away and make them slaves. One of the villains activates his skill to finally finish off the old man and tells the kids to watch closely, as this is what happens when someone goes up against the evil dragons. At that moment, Chuck and Shelley suddenly burst in. Jeff recognizes Chuck right away, because it's not easy to forget the guy who kicked his ass in front of the crowd, because no one has ever done that before. Shelley recognizes them as the evil dragons that rule this city. One of them activates his skill again and threatens them with death. He declares that no one has ever been able to stop them before. Jeff walks up to Chuck and tells him that he won't be able to run anywhere this time. He laughs at him. He thinks Chuck is afraid of him and is trembling. To which Chuck replies that he is trembling with anger because he sees a man more disgusting than a monster. Suddenly, the second villain pounces on Chuck and they merge in battle. The villain realizes during their fight that Chuck has tremendous strength and suggests that he back off, telling him that they are both incredibly strong and there is no telling how this battle might end. To which Chuck replies that he will never back down and will go all the way. All Chuck had to do was use his skill and turn into a monster, then he would have ended this battle instantly. But he couldn't do that because Shelly and the kids were around, so he realized that he needed to do everything he could to save everyone. Meanwhile, a villain stabs a sword into Chuck's stomach, but he turns his body into a monster, and then keeps the sword in his stomach, using the monster's hard skin and regeneration. No one notices his body transformation, and he takes that chance and kills one of the evil dragons. Chuck turns around to help Shelly, who is fighting Jeff, and Jeff realizes that he finds himself in a bad situation, and he's surrounded. And he decides to escape. To do so, he uses a skill called Poison Mist. He also warns that this is not the end, and that a group of evil dragons will come to take revenge. Chuck, using regeneration to heal his wound, and realized that he had to leave as soon as possible because his strength was running out and he could turn into a monster at any moment. Meanwhile, Shelly was concerned that the place was no longer safe and they needed to evacuate from here immediately. But her father told her that they were very poor to move to the capital. Chuck was pondering in his head that he needed a much higher level of strength, and the two level up quickly. He needed monsters of a higher level than himself. He pondered that if he got rid of this whole disaster, the knights of the capital would definitely come and take care of the group of evil dragons.